Hello, hello, hello. Let us continue learning through Black literature. And do not forget, the current book that we're going through is Black Fortunes. And this week, we're going to go through some more excerpts before we deep dive back into some additional history that will help you as you go through the chapters. Now, today, let's start on page 19. The whaling boom also created a middle and upper class in Nantucket. Benefiting from racial stereotypes about their unnatural strength, Black men were recruited to the island to hunt whales. Whaling offered a much better life than slave labor or tenement farming. In addition, men who worked on whaling crews were often shareholders, not employees, and were entitled to a percentage of the profits from the whales they helped bring in. When we talk about the disparity in business, when it comes to other ethnicities, other nationalities, other than white people, this is what we mean. And that whole myth, the racial tropes, that the mental capacity, the work ethic just isn't there. Yes, it is. It's always been there. It's just certain demographics were given the moniker of laziness when it was time to pay for labor. And the desire to steal, not pay Black people what they're worth, affects everyone today. Everyone. As a result of the emergence of the whaling industry, Pleasant was raised in a boom town. She watched as people flocked to Nantucket to work on whaling ships, to open oil refineries or hotels and saloons to cater to the growing population. Some people made fortunes in Nantucket, others lost them. The lessons she learned from witnessing the boom would one day prove themselves useful. Now, if you remember, Madam Pleasant, since she was not being afforded the ability to go to school as promised by the good old Quaker family, she decided to educate herself, and part of her education was learning people. And just like every Black person, since the concept and the societal standard and hierarchy of race has been established and upheld and combined with racism, we have had to know more about white people than they've known about themselves. Now on page 21. All right. Now page 21, my apologies. One day, James W. Smith, a well-dressed, middle-aged businessman, entered the shop where she worked to do some shopping. He caught Pleasant's eye as she was doing her work. I made sure to strike up a conversation with him before he left, she remembered. Smith didn't say much about himself, but he did say he was Cuban. Remember, in previous episodes, I told you all that a lot of biracial, multiracial, especially men of the time, would identify as Cuban for societal acceptance purposes. Identifying as Hispanic awarded him a racial ambiguity that allowed him to better navigate the United States racial caste system. The proportions of Spanish, Taino Indian, and African blood he possessed were simply left to the imagination, allowing him to avoid being classified as colored, even under the strictest interpretation of the one-drop rule. Pleasant did not discover a bit of information about Smith. She learned that he was an abolitionist. Now, I know many of you will go, but Taz, Afro-Indigenous exist, Afro-Latina exist, Afro-Hispanic exists. Yes, Yes. Uh, but also remember that there were a lot of very fair skinned mixed race individuals that were able to pass as white because historically, white people tend to pay closer attention to complexion than they do anything else. They rarely pick up on phenotypes, they rarely pick up on hair textures. That's why you get a lot of, especially white women, thinking they can identify with black women just because they have curly hair and thinking that it is the same thing. You catching what I'm putting down? And these are people who don't have the internet at their hands, don't have societies that are completely or diverse or multicultural at this point. These are people who are fervently segregating themselves. But if you're exotic, you have their eye. That's why now, even to this day, you'll hear people, "Oh, she's an exotic Latina." Or they'll come across a black person who doesn't look as they believe in their head black people should look, because they try to claim we all look alike. And they'll ask, "Oh, what are you mixed with? What's in your background?" Black, black, and black, and more black, and two more scoops of black. Let's go on to page 25. Late in 1848, gold was discovered in California. Men from all over the country and the world left wives, jobs, and families behind to try to become rich in the California gold rush. Money began to be a priority. You went from taking over land where bartering was top tier. You come from ancestors that learned how to barter with other people to now slapping a price on everything and creating a monetary system and creating a goal for this monetary system, and that goal being collecting and hoarding as much as you possibly can, regardless of how that affects anyone, including your own kinfolk. Because you heard men were leaving families. And this is during a time where white women specifically weren't working like that. A lot of them could not work legally in some places. A lot of them could not work because they had no skill set. They were raised to be mothers and wives. And with other ethnicities of women already in the job pool, where was the demand? Because also during this time, you had Black women that were becoming street vendors and Black men becoming street vendors and barbers and things like that. Hell, even the first president of the United States would not eat food that was not prepared by the hands of a Black person. So where would they fit in? Maybe, depending on the size of their city, becoming a washwoman. But if all the men are leaving, who's going to pay for the washwomen? Just like today, you see a lot of white women in what I call luxury jobs, where they're supplying luxury or teaching someone how to have a luxurious lifestyle, whether they've actually lived it or not. But they're not essential, they're not necessary. Let's continue. President James K. Polk evangelized for men to set out for San Francisco in his State of the Union address in December 1848, which was reprinted in Nantucket and Boston papers. The accounts of the abundance of gold in the territory, California, are of such extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by the authentic reports of officers in the public service who have visited the mineral district and derived the facts which they detail from personal observation. Y'all get to see where "trust me, bro" came from. He said in his national address. He added that labor commands a most exorbitant price in all other pursuits, but that of searching for the precious metals are abandoned. Nearly the whole of the male population of the country have gone to the gold districts. After Polk's address, men began to leave Nantucket for California. Whaling schooners were converted into transport ships to take them there. Now, remember how the whaling industry was already taking formerly enslaved people and making them middle class. So just imagine what it was doing for white people. But that desire to have the wealth, especially the wealth that was being accumulated during the antebellum period, is too much to pass up. Only difference is now they have to do the work for themselves. But let's continue. By 1849, more than 500 men from Nantucket had left the island for California. Among them were Pleasant's new husband, J.J., and several members of the Hussey clan. Deserted on Nantucket by J.J. and much of her surrogate family. Stockholm Syndrome is a motherfucker. And see, you see a few journals, hear a few stories passed down, and this is why the Daughters of the Confederacy are able to so successfully push the lie, the narrative. This, slaves were treated well. We treated them like family, because even Thomas Jefferson referred to slaves as family and friends, but treated them like shit. And you have a lot, even post antebellum Black people, that had to believe that the white people in the closest proximity to them had their best interest at hand to just keep from giving up, to keep from realizing that they're in lands that don't welcome them, that don't want them past their bodies. And I want you to think about that for a moment. How well would you cope knowing that when you look up, you look down, you look to the right, you look to the left, the only thing that people want you for, the only value you hold is your body. They don't care if you're having a good day, a bad day, if you're sick, healthy, what your dreams or aspirations are. They just want your body, whether your body for profit or your body for pleasure. So maybe think about that next time you hear someone give their point of view, share their lived experience, and you hear someone else quick to say, it's just clothes, it's just hair, it's just this, it's just that. It's just another example of non-white folk not being seen as human. Pleasant made up her mind that she would go to California too. She had connections there and now possessed a small fortune as a result of her inheritance from her first husband. She had a chance at thriving there, just as the male 49ers were doing. Besides, she felt she needed to keep an eye on JJ. Now let's go on to 27. And a lot of people try to separate the highly bastardized, highly edited, tyrannical pseudo Protestant Christianity that is still preached upon today in the United States. They try to separate that from the days of slavery, going, oh, no, 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 no. That's old. That's not going on anymore. We don't feel that way anymore. Oh, that's not what they meant about the scriptures regarding slavery. This no, no. Let's go on. Let's talk about Emmeline. Inside a church made of laid stone and canopied by trees on a clearing in the woodlands of Arkansas, an enslaved woman named Emmeline was summoned to the front of the congregation to undergo a confirmation ceremony. She was purportedly the first enslaved person to undergo the ritual in the state. The faces of the congregant at the Episcopal Church of Arkansas were of slave-owning families from the cotton plantations of the western part of the state. They watched with absorption as she marched to the front of the congregation. Not only would Emmeline confirm her faith, but she would also join slave-owning men and women as a member of the congregation and a sister in Christ. You want people to learn your version of religion, but they can't read. Therefore, one very pivotal component of your religion, to study to show thyself approved unto God, they cannot do. But you want to give them a glimmer of hope that even though in the secular world we are not and will not ever be equal, in the church house, in the spirit of God, we're somewhat equal. You can't sit down here next to me. You got to go up to the peanut gallery. And you can build these churches for us because we need good, strong, strapping Black folk to continue to build these church houses for us. But we will be equal in the bosom of God once we get past these pearly gates. He gonna build you a mansion up there. But down here, you got to suffer because you're suffering. Your suffering will be rewarded once you get to a place when you have a new body and new memories and can't recognize any of your family members. So you're going to go on to glory in solitude. And see that suffering upon earth and, the holy get it the most, really, because these pastors never got it the most. They never got it the worst. But aren't they supposed to be the shepherds for the sheep? Just like now are setting you up to accept abuse, to accept toxicity, to accept an unequal power dynamic. Because eventually, in your new body, with your new mind, without the ability to recognize anyone, and basically you are nubile all over again, you'll get material things that aren't supposed to matter to you. But let's continue. Emmeline was a fair-skinned Black woman described as the most beautiful type of Creole, meaning she was lighter than most. She was unmarried and had 2 children by 2 different men. That couldn't be held against her, as her body had been sold and rented out at various points by the family who owned her, who claimed that she lived the most Christian life of anyone we ever met. Of course, because she was unable to consent to anything. Sins were committed against her. She was not committing sins. But notice how they didn't bring up who should be held accountable and who those sins should be held against, especially post age 13. The confirmation ceremony consisted of a series of questions about accepting Christ and renouncing evil, which had to be answered affirmatively. It ended with prayers and the laying of hands. Emmeline's ceremony was presided over by Bishop George Washington Freeman. We talked about him previously. A stoic man who dressed in gray vests and jackets with a preacher's collar on his shirt. He put his hands on Emmeline's head and shoulders and prayed over her as amens arose from the congregation. With this sacrament, she hoped a place would be prepared for her in heaven. She was near the end of her life, and she was getting her affairs in order. Emmeline was on borrowed time. At nearly 40 years of age, she had surpassed the normal life expectancy for an enslaved person and had lived a long life for her era. In the 1850s, the average lifespan of an enslaved African American was between 22 and 36 years. And here you thought little orphan Annie had a hard knock life. Between tetanus contracted from rusted farm equipment, food and waterborne illnesses, sexually transmitted infections, disease carrying mosquitoes, and hemorrhaging childbirth, enslaved people were considered lucky to reach their 30th year. Emmeline had survived dozens of outbreaks of cholera, malaria, and yellow fever in the mosquito infested backwater of the Mississippi Delta. She had survived the doctorless births of her two sons, but now she was waning. And as the year 1851 dawned on the plantation where she lived, near the Arkansas Tennessee state line, she could sense that she had entered the final stretch of her life. She had lived in one form or another of bondage since birth, and she hoped that before she joined her Lord of Lords and her ancestors in the afterlife, she could secure the freedom of her children, Robert Reed Church and James Wilson. Now, out of the two children, which one do you think was the product of being sold out for pleasure? If you said the one that has a middle name, you would be correct. Emmeline was born on a tobacco plantation, and we spoke about her just a little bit last week, outside Norfolk, Virginia. Her exact birth date was never recorded, but she was told that she was born about the year 1815. And remember, she was gifted to the youngest of her original owner, Rosalie Virginia Burton, who claimed that Emmeline was like a sister to her. Now, like I said last week, I don't know what sister is out here selling the body of her sister. But see, that sister, brother, auntie, she was like a grandmother to me, was just a way of mentally tricking everyone involved and surrounding slavery into not truly thinking about the horror they were putting other humans through. Because we know through historical texts, through journals, through stories passed down, how few Black people were viewed as people. Our own United States Constitution shows us unequivocally that Black people were not originally considered human. Census reports show us that the United States and its citizenry did not see Black folk as human. But requiring control over our own lives is considered inhumane. Oh, the irony. Oh, the irony. Hmm. One would think that the long game, pay attention now, was just to find a way to consistently enslave Black people and remove any desire or pathways towards no longer being enslaved. And for those that like to put forth the argument that, well, release the mental shackles of your mind. First of all, slavery was beyond just physical. If you don't believe that it was also mental, emotional, you need to go back to square one before you can come up to this conversation. Chattel slavery was so horrific that Black people with a long-standing heritage within the United States have had our DNA permanently altered. And given how families were broken apart and dispersed all over the country, when incest and things like that started to become illegal, although it was being forced upon Black people, I personally feel that it wasn't because they were disgusted by incest, because they still pull that shit off today, even to the great lengths of hiding it or moving to other jurisdictions or even other countries to continue their incestuous relationships. Hell, Elon Musk's own father is proud of having two children with his former stepdaughter. But I digress. I digress. I believe it was more of a way to catch up Black people. It's just a thought, just a theory. No different than the period of time where interracial relationships were illegal, but those laws were only, when you want to talk about a two-tier justice system, they were only put forth towards predominantly Black men, but Black people in said relationships. Even during the time of antebellum, there were Black women that were beaten to a pulp or even murdered because they were being sexually assaulted. But they looked upon it as a relationship, and that these white men that had the fortitude to lead a country, lead families, and own plantations, and be a head of an overseer of slaves could be brought to his knees and so easily manipulated by creatures that were not deemed human or had the capacity of intellect. See, if you can pull out the hypocrisy that surrounds Magadonians, how can you not pull out the hypocrisy that is racism? See, you want to go along with racist ideologies and tropes, just like MAGA supporters want to go along with the bullshit that's fed to them, because it's all about making you comfortable, not about making sense. That is why between 2021 and 2022, were you aware that there was only 11 people behind all of those book bannings? There was a mother who vowed to report a book, one book per week. She didn't want anybody to have access to it. It wasn't about protecting her particular child. It wasn't about protecting any child. It was about protecting ideologies, because when you put anything under scrutiny and it cannot hold up, how long does it actually stay an ideology? Because even with the tyrannical pseudo Christianity that we all know as Protestant Christianity within the United States, without indoctrinating children from a young age or presenting itself as a refuge, as a do over for broken-hearted adults, single parents, divorcees, where would it stand? Where would it stand? It wouldn't stand much of anywhere. just as racism should no longer stand within the United States, especially in a day and age where we have a multitude of social media platforms and the internet, where you no longer just have to trust me, bro, through life when someone tells you a stereotype regarding a community that you do not belong to or you were not raised around, because you could belong to a community and not be raised around it. Hence the fact that you have so many contested coalition members running around, and you can now should be able to discern the difference between a grifter who is utilizing race to line their pockets and those who are really attempting to deconstruct their racism, internalized or otherwise. Now, I'm trying to keep these segments a little bit shorter. So, next week, we're going to go through a few more excerpts, and then we're going to get right back into uh, deep diving into the extra history needed so that you can fully grasp the stories told in these books. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe, and make sure you click the bell and turn on notifications. And if you feel like you've learned anything, please share with a friend. As always, each one teach one, each one reach one. Till next time.